All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ryan Turnbull, and I'm the Diocesan Discipleship Developer. And this is lecture number 3 of our Words Strain Lectures in Anglican Poetics series. So far, we've been to St. John's Cathedral for a talk on T.S. Eliot and silence. And last week, we went out to Brandon to St. Matthew's Cathedral, where we heard a really inspiring lecture on Henry Vaughan and the Poetics of Hope. And this evening, we are here in Holy Trinity downtown to hear about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And part of the reason we chose this venue for this evening is because if you look at the pillars, particularly on that side, you'll see little faces carved in there. And we're going to be learning about what those faces are all about tonight. But we wanted, part of the kind of the idea behind this project is to tie together the kind of the poetic imagination of Anglican worship and theology with some of our sacred spaces all around the diocese and kind of draw these connections on the imaginative level. So we're on this little pilgrimage around the diocese to kind of like explore this tradition of Anglican poetics and poetry. And as a little souvenir of this pilgrimage that we're on, local artist Seika Dick has created this wonderful series of stamps that you can pick up at the back. So for each church, we've got a different unique stamp. Sally's holding up the one for Holy Trinity here. So if you come to the rest of the lectures, we got, 3 more to go? And we'll talk a bit more about those at the end. You can collect all of these stamps and have a little memento of your time here. I'm going to now turn it over to Bishop Don Phillips, who's going to introduce us here to Holy Trinity this evening.
I'm going to bend down rather than mess with the mic. Thank you very much, Ryan. So welcome to Holy Trinity. The kind of amusing thing here is usually you think, okay, so this is the cleric who's been here for 15 years and can tell you everything about the building. Well, I think I've been here for a little over 2 months, so I'm not the knowledgeable guy in the building. And fortunately, one of our lay leaders, Mackie Steele here, has pitched in with me tonight, and we're going to try to offer you a little bit of hospitality partway through the evening. But before that, just so you know where these things are, we have some washrooms, which are through this door here. And if you go down there, and on the right-hand side, down a few steps, are 2 gender-neutral washrooms. If you don't want to do the steps, keep going down the hall further, hang your first left, and go about halfway down that hall, and there's another washroom there as well. If you have any other questions about the place or running into any difficulty during the time, Mackie and I will be sitting over there. And the way we've planned this, and tonight's speaker is fine with this, he'll give his presentation. Then there'll be a short break. We'll wheel out a little cart over here with some decaf coffee, tea, water, some cookies, and you can sort of grab something from there and then come back and sit down, and then he'll have his question period then. So I'd like to call up Paul Dick to introduce tonight's speaker.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. David Watt, my friend. I first got to know David 20-some years ago through our mutual interest in the medieval and Renaissance books in the U of M archives and the CMU archives. And since then, I've come to appreciate him ever more as a capable organizer, a principled leader, a gifted teacher, and a recipient of a recent teaching award, and a great lover of literature. He is one of those special people who brings a theological sensibility to the texts he reads, and who thus can see in those old texts something nuanced. And he sees how spiritual things are worked out in our daily manners. As a reader, he's both deeply sensible and energetically inspired. David is the chair of English and Film Studies at the U of M and is a fellow of St. John's College. He has published 2 books, including most recently Laughter and Awkwardness in Late Medieval England, Social Discomfort in the Literature of the Middle Ages, as well as many articles. And tonight he's going to speak about one of my favorite medieval stories, the long poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I've deeply enjoyed discussing this poem with David in the past, and I'm most eager to hear him talk about it tonight here at Holy Trinity among the green men. Please welcome David Watt.
Well, thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to Ryan and Paul for organizing this. I feel very welcome and excited to be here. Paul, just before I left tonight, he said, well, I really hope you talk about, and then this is what he hoped I would talk about. So here it is, but I think it's appropriate. So I'll only read a little Middle English tonight. We might come back afterwards because I'll do things mostly in translation. But there's a little line here. Gawain goes off in his quest, and he started going out there, and he's been fighting with wild men and all sorts of other things, and ogres and that kind of thing. And then we hear he might have been dead many times. I always ask my class, how can he be dead more than once? But anyway, he then, it turns out that Verwere wrath him not so much that winter nas worse. Then the cold clear water from the Cludes shada, and fres hit fele, meet to the falla earth. Near slain with the sleet, he slipped in his earnes, mo mictes than enough in naked rockas. So basically it tells us how, the fighting was bad, but the weather was really terrible. It rained, and in fact, as the cold water fell from the sky, it froze before it got to the ground, and he was nearly killed by the sleet that hit him. So all of you who braved the sleet outside tonight, well done. You're if you didn't complain about it nearly as much as Gawain, then you're already ahead. So with that, I will start. And so we were discussing, it took me a long time to come up with a title, so thankfully Paul was very patient about that. And eventually I decided on It's Not Easy Being Green, the place of nature in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And that was partly inspired by coming here, but also the opportunity to come here to this building. So it's a privilege for me to be here with you tonight on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Oyate, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. And that's the next slide, Ryan. I'm also pleased to be here with you tonight in Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which was built from 1883 to 1884 in what is known as the Gothic Revival style. So the Gothic Revival began in England in the mid-18th century as a way of connecting the medieval past to the English present. It was popular among High Church Anglicans in particular, who saw continuity between their practices and the pre-Reformation English tradition. So they're bringing the past, the present in England, and it then got transferred to Canada. In fact, it was an English architect who designed this church, and it was used here to forge a geographic and temporal connection. So basically rewriting the Canadian past as an English or European one and transferring that over in the territory of Indigenous people. So often effacing that past, but certainly at least merging with it and trying to lay a claim to this territory. So it's therefore no coincidence that Parliament, universities, and churches were built in this style right around the period of Confederation and afterwards, at the height of the Gothic Revival, but also that's clearly connected to the Gothic Revival. So one consequence of the ubiquity of the Gothic Revival in Canada is that Canadians are just as familiar with some of the aspects of 14th century architecture as the author and audience of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight might have been. And here's the next slide. So I'm going to focus on one of these elements, although there are many of them up around here, and that is the green man imagery that appears on the column capitals. And these appear throughout churches in the Middle Ages, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Often on column capitals, sometimes as corbels, sometimes as bosses on ceilings. So in Gothic and Gothic Revival churches, these figures invite us to consider the place of nature in a sacred place, and the place of the sacred in nature. These particular figures also invite us to reflect critically on the assumption that nature and the sacred can or should be distinguished, and about the cultural norms that underlie that assumption. So my aim tonight is not to resolve any of these tensions, but to keep them in mind as we consider how images of the Green Man might help us to understand the place of nature in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So green men have a long history, so they've often been considered pagan symbols adopted for Christian use. But they certainly proliferated as symbols in English churches from the Norman Conquest through the English Reformation, so basically 1066 through the 1530s. Many incorporate, next one. Many incorporate biblical motifs, such as this one that connects Adam to Christ. And I'll get you to go again, it's a little bit, just back one. It's just a little close up. Yeah, so it's a little closer up there. You can see the green man right at the bottom there. And basically the foliage that's coming out creates this sort of tree of mercy that also might be connected to sort of tree of Jesse that's connecting Adam through to Mary and then to Christ. So it's fully integrated. It's not like this is a pagan symbol versus a Christian symbol. There's a full integration going on here. Many green men appear to be completely aligned with the natural world, and this is the next one. And I'll point to the image on the right-hand side here in Canterbury Cathedral. So they're completely aligned with nature since they're either covered by or integrated into foliation. Others, though, seem to suggest it isn't easy being green, as nature seems to erupt from inside them, and that's the one on the left. And often they have this sort of expression of either sort of, shock or pain, or sometimes possibly laughter that we'll come to later. But there's always this sense that it's erupting or emerging from them involuntarily. Literally and figuratively, these latter figures suggest that nature has the potential to threaten one's integrity, creating pain or at least discomfort by erupting from the body. These figures embody a thoroughly Christian idea in the Middle Ages, whereby human experience can be understood as a kind of debate between the bodies governed by earthly desires and souls drawn to heavenly things. Next one, Ryan. The Green Knight is obviously a green man. He's completely green, and he's not actually in this image, which is a little odd. All the men, though, kind of look like this guy. They're all sort of bald with this little beard or mustache and goatee, including, it goes back earlier in the manuscript. So like Lot actually Lot isn't in the manuscript, but Jonah looks almost exactly the same. They all sort of look like this. But he is described as being completely green. His skin is green, his hair is green, everything about him is green. So his entry into Camelot also includes him holding a piece of greenery, a holly branch that marks the Christmas season. And it marks the eruption of nature into the most civilized of societies at that time, just as the green men in Holy Trinity bring nature into the church. Gawain can also be understood as a green man, though, and this is less, I think, explored. He's not literally green, although he does seem to match the Green Knight in this particular instance, although he's not wearing green. But he's green in other ways, in figurative ways, in that he's sick about what he's agreed to do, and throughout the text, he's sort of nervous about that, and he's also immature or not quite ripe. And both of those senses actually originate in the 13th century, so they would have been available to this author. He also discovers he's the kind of green man from whom nature erupts as the poem reaches its climax, and that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. Gawain learns what Kermit the Frog also knew. It's not easy being green, and that's what makes Gawain such a compelling poem. So the three poems that precede Gawain in its medieval manuscript are three overtly Christian poems known as Pearl, Cleanness, and Patience. Richard Frith Green has recently argued that the language of Gawain and its incorporation of occult material suggest it was written by a different author than the other poems. I'm perfectly willing to concede that because Richard knows much more about it than me on linguistic grounds, but I nonetheless believe Gawain offers a remarkably effective conclusion to this group of poems because it transposes their questions about the nature of grace from a spiritual to a secular key. Like Pearl, Cleanness, and Patience, it invites readers to recognize that the limits of human understanding make it difficult to understand grace. Even the most noble knight might struggle to accept he is worthy of it. Gawain achieves this effect by employing the same elements, mood, kinesic imagery, and dialogue as the other three poems to draw on the audience's innate empathic responses to awkward situations, designed to test the nature of Arthur's court by ingeniously violating the norms associated with social interaction in courtly society. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what kinesic imagery means a little later. Throughout most of the poem, Gawain seems to be able to meet the external threat that nature seems to pose to courtly life. For he initially overcomes the Green Knight in that he delivers him a blow and in return will receive one, and he's able to battle the the elements and the wildlife. Elephants are actually one of the few things not mentioned, and wildlife in his quest to fulfill his promise. He also overcomes the internal threats that his human nature seemed to create for him as he responds gracefully to a series of awkward circumstances. That is, at least, until the poem's climactic moment, when he refuses to accept the grace he's offered. Through this moment, Gawain and his audience come to recognize that he may not be the Green Knight, but he is a Green Knight who cannot prevent his nature from emerging in the end. Thus, this poem suggests Gawain's human nature is both the reason he cannot accept grace and precisely why he needs it. Since I'll need to jump around in the poem a little bit to make this argument, I'm going to give you a summary of Gawain and the Green Knight. I don't assume all of you have read it, but even if you had, maybe you'll need a little reminder. So Gawain, the character, is basically involved in two interconnected exchange games, but he doesn't know that they're both connected, and he doesn't know they're both games necessarily. He kind of comes to recognize this. The first begins in the poem's first part, or fit. The Green Knight, representing, as I said, the incursion of the natural world into Camelot, challenges Arthur's court to a Christmastide game in which he will receive an uncontested axe blow now in exchange for the opportunity to strike an uncontested blow in 1 year's time. He laughs at the men of court, accusing them of being green in the sense of inexperienced, and he calls them children without beards. Shamed by the Green Knight's laughter at the awkward silence that greets this challenge, Arthur agrees to enter into a forward or agreement to play the game himself. But Gawain realizes this puts the realm in jeopardy. So he steps in and slices the Green Knight's head from his body in front of everyone at the New Year's feast. So while he initially seems to represent nature, the Green Knight then apparently violates nature's norms by picking up his severed head and telling Gawain, "I'll meet you in a year's time at the Green Chapel so we can fulfill the promise." Now the second fit describes Gawain's emergence from the court into nature, where he has to overcome a cold and lonely journey, part of which I've just described, as well as many foes in the wilderness, including encounters with wild or green men before he finds the mysterious Green Chapel. Losing hope, he prays to Mary and finds himself at the castle Haute Désert, or High Deserving basically, 3 days before his appointment with the Green Knight. At Haute Désert, Gawain is greeted by a host named Bertilac, who tells him the chapel he seeks is nearby and invites him to stay in the warmth and luxury until the appointed day to meet the Green Knight. Bertilac suggests that they enter a forward, and this should have been a clue maybe to Gawain, but it's a very common word. So he says, "Let's play a game. Bertilac will exchange what he wins while hunting for whatever Gawain wins while hanging around the castle." Fit 3 describes this game, which gets awkward when Bertilac's wife violates the norms of hospitality by trying to seduce Gawain each day, insisting it would be ungracious of him to violate the norms of courtesy by refusing her. Gawain exchanges 1 kiss for a deer on the first day, 2 kisses for a boar on the second, and 3 kisses for a fox on the third. But on the final day, Gawain refuses a ring from the lady that she offers as a token of her affection, but he does accept a girdle, only because the wife tells him that the wearer cannot be killed. In Fit 4, Gawain meets the Green Knight and the Green Chapel on the appointed day. After 2 false strikes that naturally cause Gawain to flinch, the Green Knight finally connects with a blow, nicking Gawain's neck just a little. When Gawain realizes he's been spared, the Green Knight explains that the 2 games were connected. He is Bertilac, and the only reason he gave Gawain a nick in the neck was that he kept the girdle. Although the Green Knight offers reassuring words about the grace he has shown, Gawain is overcome with shame, and his emotions seem to erupt out of him like the foliage that erupts out of some of the green men. So when Gawain returns to the court to recount his story, his shame erupts from within him again. It's so obvious that he feels this shame that Arthur himself tries to comfort him. Laughter then erupts from the entire court, who decide to adopt the garter as their symbol. And this is, in fact, at the end, we get the Order of the Garter, sort of the Order of the Garter motto in the Gawain manuscript. That is "Honi soit qui mal y pense," and it's basically shame on him who thinks ill of it or who thinks badly of it. So next slide here, Ryan. So I'm going to read this one in Middle English, but the rest of them I'm going to put the Middle English up there and just read in Modern English. But I'll start with Middle English and then read the Modern English. The king comforts the knicht, and all the court else lachen loud thereat and lovely according. That lords and ladies that long to the table each burned of the brotherhood a bodrick should have, a bend a belief him about of a breeked grain, and that for sack of that sage in sweat to wear. So you can get the sense of the alliteration that's going on here, and if we want to read more, we can do that a little later. So the king comforts the knight, and all the rest of the court laughs loudly thereat, and lovingly agrees that lords and nobles that belong to the table, each man of the brotherhood, should have a baldric wrapped all about him, of a bright green, and wear it in honor for that man's sake. Now, Robert Longsworth claims this laughter that the knights share, and that kind of, again, erupts out of them, that just sort of emerges, that it invites interpretation. And I would agree, and I'd like to focus on two questions. First, does Gawain laugh with them? It says all the court laughs, but it doesn't explicitly tell us about Gawain. I hope that he does, but given the way the poem unfolds, I fear that he doesn't, and that, in fact, he's the only one not laughing. My sense that Gawain does not laugh raises a second question that's specific to the Gawain manuscript context. Does Gawain's refusal to go along with it make him more like Lot, whose story is told in the poem Cleanness, or Jonah, whose story is told in the poem Patience? And here maybe I'll do a little brief aside to say, so the first poem in the manuscript, Pearl, is about a father who's deeply upset at the loss of, it turns out, his daughter. He keeps on talking about the pearl he's lost, and then this young woman comes and comforts him and talks a little bit about him, and then it becomes evident that he's not talking about having literally lost a pearl. He's talking about the daughter who he's lost, who then explains she's fine. She's actually gone to heaven. She's, in fact, been elevated as one of the brides of Christ. And then he's like, hey, wait a minute. You died very young. How did you get elevated to this sort of level? And so he's kind of upset. He doesn't understand grace, and he's trying to work out how it works. Then the next poem, Cleanness, it basically uses the same verse, but sort of starts with the same verse from Matthew, but then sort of shifts it, and it's all about sort of purity, and only the pure can achieve grace. And one of the stories it tells is about Lot and Lot's wife, who of course turns into salt in the desert. But a lot of it is about sort of who has the right to sort of make judgment and why those judgments are made, and also how groups often develop a kind of mood amongst themselves and either turn against Lot or turn towards the angels or turn against the angels. And so it's a really interesting sort of way in which that story unfolds. And then finally, Patience is this story of Jonah, who basically, is just an awkward guy. God tells him, you should go preach. And he's like, yeah, no, they'll kill me if I preach there. And so he goes off and of course ends up in Wales and ends up eventually there, and then preaches so wonderfully that all the people of the city turn, right? And then they say, yes, we will accept God, and they gnash their teeth and they show signs of repentance. And God says, okay, I'm going to spare them. And Jonah's like, what? You made a liar out of me. I told them they were all going to be condemned, and now you've forgiven them. And he's like, yeah, that was supposed to be part of the preaching. And so Jonah gets very upset. But one of the things that's interesting, I think, about this is these two create this kind of contrast where Lot basically is willing to follow God and to just align his will with God entirely, where Jonah is very much unwilling to do that. And so this question of what mood is sort of Gawain adopting at the end? Is he unwilling to go along with what the court believes, or is he unwilling to sort of recognize God's grace? So we're not sure how to interpret it. So that idea that this laughter invites interpretation is really getting us beyond just why are they laughing to what does that laughter mean? What would it mean to laugh along or not? So I'm not going to provide a definitive answer to the questions that I've asked about whether Gawain not laughing makes him unwilling to fit in or unable to experience belonging. But I am going to suggest that the compilation invites us to ask these questions and to consider what might be gained by trying to understand the relationship between Gawain's sense of shame and the alienation he feels from others in the court. So Gawain's penultimate stanza explains why Arthur feels obliged to comfort Gawain in the final stanza. It connects the shame Gawain feels with the grace that he has been granted. The poet explains that Gawain, that through grace had been granted his life, before explaining that he encountered too many adventures on his way back to Arthur's court to describe here. But when he does arrive at court, Gawain focuses exclusively on the part of his adventure related to the exchange of blows. So he doesn't tell them all about everything else, just about the exchange of blows. And then the bob and wheel, so this sort of part at the end here that ends the stanza, shifts the emphasis from the story's details to its mood. And yeah, this is the right slide here. The love of the lady and finally the garter, the scar in the neck nakedly he showed, that he caught for his lack of faith at the knight's hands for blame. He grieved when he should tell, he groaned for grief and sorrow, the blood in his face gathered together, when it should show for shame. Now, I just want to say briefly, it's interesting. So he focuses, this is his interpretation, right? That he says, I caught this for a lack of faith. It was my lack of faith that led me to have this. And that's kind of what the knight said, but the Green Knight didn't quite say it like that. He said, I did it because you took the garter. And he's saying it was my lack of faith that caused me to take the garter. I didn't believe either I was saved or would be safe without it. And I needed this thing to sort of protect me. Now, both the image of Gawain's scar and his blush make me a little uncomfortable. These images are linked neurologically and thematically, and their impact on the reader relies on the way our empathic brains simulate instances of motion. This is what I mean by kinesic responses. And that's basically that our minds sort of can see in someone else what's happening to them and then simulate it and often feel that feeling. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. I'm not going to get too graphic, although some of you may recognize one of them, and it may be more or less sort of graphic. So I'll explain that a little bit. The reason that the description of Gawain's scar makes me feel a little green can be explained through motor neurons. So Christian Kaisers is a neuroscientist who explains that most of us have experienced a scenario in which the pain of another makes us feel physically unwell. Our experience of viewing pain goes beyond mere understanding, and we literally feel the pain in a vivid and localized fashion. To help readers experience this, Kaisers gives the example of someone cutting their finger, but you might find it more evocative to imagine watching someone scrape their hands and knees on the pavement. That's the one that always gets me, is especially thinking about somebody falling off a bike, right? Having watched my children, having experienced that myself, I know what that feels like. And just imagining it is enough to make me feel it in my body. If you're not bothered by the image of Gawain's scar as I've presented it, it might help to recall the poem's vivid description of how the Green Knight made the cut that has now become the scar. And here's the next slide. He lightly lifts his weapon and let it down fair, and with the barb it bit by the bare neck. Though he lunged heartily, he hurt him no more, but it nicked him on that one side that severed the skin. The blade sunk into the flesh through the glistening fat that the bright blood over his shoulders shot to the earth. And I'll give you a little sense of the swinging of the axe in the air really comes through in the alliterative. So here you go. But snert him on that sida that severed the hida. The sharp shrank to the flesh through the sheer aggressor, that the sheen of blood over his shoulders shot to the earth. So you get that sense of the axe coming down through the air as it just nicks him in the neck, though he thinks one thing is happening, but something else happens. So your empathic response to this event likely depends on how vividly you are able to imagine it. And it may not be because you've experienced exactly having someone try to cut your head off with an axe or being in battle, although Gawain's audience may well have been able to imagine that. For me, I have a strong visceral response to this scene because my mind often goes to a different moment that I saw when I was a child. And that's the next slide, please. I'm not going to show you exactly the image, but you may recognize Clint Malarchuk here, who played in net for the Buffalo Sabres and was actually played as junior hockey in Fort Saskatchewan, where I also played as a teenager. So a skate blade cut Clint Malarchuk's neck, partly slicing his carotid artery and jugular vein. And so I saw this just coming. I was like, why are they showing these highlights? And all of a sudden, you see the blood going on the ice. And I have the sense my own neck has been cut every time I see the video again. And I feel queasiness in my stomach. I might even turn green. The incident also prompted a strong empathic response among those who witnessed the event in person, a kind of eruption of nature that overcomes the will. 11 fans fainted, 2 had heart attacks, and 3 players vomited on the ice. So this sort of eruption of what they were seeing and that pain that they were experiencing themselves, watching what was happening. And this is what I imagine is the potential outcome of even a nick on Gawain's neck. I suspect any member of a society in which injuries caused by sharpened or perhaps dull blades were commonplace must likewise have had a fairly strong response as they anticipated the blow and read about the initial flow of blood that the poem describes. So either if they're Gawain's audience, right, Gawain telling them, or the audience of the poem hearing this and imagining it, right, they're likely able to imagine this fairly vividly. Next slide. So my visceral response to Gawain's scar engages my empathic brain in the same way Gawain's blush does later in the scene, because blushing also can have this effect. As Gawain recounts in his story, the blood on his face conmel for shame, so the blood in his face gathered together for shame. Now, the brain often forms judgments about emotional states through direct facial mimicry. So if we see someone wince in pain, he writes, our face contracts as if we're in pain. We can then deduce the emotional state of that person by sensing the configuration of our own mimic facial expression. We don't always have to actually do it. Our face doesn't necessarily have to do it, but we can imagine what it was like to feel that, and we actually simulate it in our minds. So both Arthur and the audience deduce Gawain's emotional state from his blush by mimicking it through simulation, whether or not they actually blush too. Arthur recognizes then Gawain needs comfort, even if he's not exactly sure why. But what certainly seems clear is Gawain's mood does not align with the rest of the courts, and the audience is likely more attuned with him than with the others, because the poem invites us to respond to his facial expression, right? That's the one that's described. We get the laughter of the court, but we get his facial expression to imagine. However, that may change for the audience, if not for Gawain, as the court laughs at the end of the text, because now we get this shift, right? First we get his face, then we shift to this laughter, because it's one way emotions can be shared through direct emotional contagion. Now, part of me wants to imagine Gawain joins in because he can't help it, for the scene would then offer a moment in which he becomes realigned with the court. And if Gawain does indeed laugh, he would likely feel even happier, because one of the more counterintuitive findings of recent neurological work is that our bodily state, including our facial expression, can influence our feelings. So often, runners are actually told this, partway through Eliud Kipchoge, this is one of his great tricks running the marathon is just smile and you'll feel happier. And in fact, this has this effect on us. If he doesn't, though, he likely feels even more alone than he was when he set out on his journey to find the Green Chapel. The ending is so effective because it invites readers to judge whether Gawain experiences awkwardness or grace at this moment. Now, one of the reasons I thought it was useful to think a little bit about Clint Malarchuk here is his life story makes me suspect that it was probably too soon, in fact, for Gawain to laugh. Malarchuk, in fact, miraculously returned to the ice 10 days, 10 or 11 days, depending on which source you read, after his neck was cut on the ice. And that was a moment, he said, he was so certain he was about to die in the dressing room afterwards, he asked for a priest to come. He continued to play hockey for a time, and then he coached. But he's now become an advocate for mental health issues, having been diagnosed with PTSD 2 decades after his life-changing injury. So according to the National Institute of Mental Health, post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that develops in some people who've experienced a shocking, scary, or dangerous event. While fear is a natural response, it also triggers many split-second changes in the body to help defend against danger or to avoid it. PTSD occurs when those changes cause people to feel stress or fright, even when they're no longer in direct danger. My aim here is not to diagnose Gawain with PTSD. He's a character in a poem written in a culture where this was not a known condition. However, a contemporary understanding of this condition might help us to understand why the poem takes what seems to be an odd turn near the end through its expression of Gawain's negative thoughts about himself or the world, and his distorted feelings of guilt and blame. And those are actually two very common expressions of PTSD, and Gawain absolutely expresses both of those. The final stanzas of Gawain invite readers to ask what it will take for Gawain to live on after an experience of trauma, of being so certain he was going to die that he asked for a priest. Now, many critics have actually questioned the efficacy of the confession that Gawain makes to the priest on the night before he sets out to the Green Chapel. The poem suggests that Gawain confesses all his sins, for greater and lesser, and mercy beseeches, and for absolution he calls on the priest. His confession seems to be pretty effective, for the priest, we hear, absolved him surely and made him so clean as if judgment day should arrive in the morning. And of course, for him, he expects it will. This seems apt, since Gawain believes his day of judgment will in fact come the next day, and he tries to make the best of things by returning to the castle to sing comely carols with the ladies. Those who see him say they've never seen him so merry, yet it seems clear he hasn't confessed everything he has done or plans to do, for he retains that girdle that promises to protect him from harm. After the Green Knight nicks Gawain's neck, he explains he withheld his stroke twice because Gawain dutifully exchanged all that he received during his first 2 days at Haute-Desert Castle. He gave a nick in the neck at the third blow because Gawain did not return the girdle he accepted on the final day. It belongs to the Green Knight, whose wife made it, and it was he who directed her to woo Gawain. Now, there's actually a little bit, for those of you who know the poem, there's a little bit at the end that then explains, no, it was actually Morgan Le Fay who directed Bertilac to direct the wife to woo Morgan Le Fay. But for now, let's go with the Green Knight. Now the next slide, please. So he explains that it's my garment you wear, the same woven girdle. My own wife wove it, I swear it to you. Now know I well your kisses and your other acts, and the wooing of my wife. I wrought it myself. I sent it to test you, and truly I think of you as the most faultless man that ever walked on foot. Furthermore, the Green Knight explains, possibly alluding to Pearl, the first poem in the manuscript, that he has found Gawain as a pearl that is more valuable than the pea. He also invites readers to reconsider the efficacy of Gawain's confession, saying, "You lacked a little, sir. Loyalty you wanted." But he says he blames him the less for that because he did not act out of lust, but because you loved your life. Gawain's response reveals he agrees with the Green Knight's assessment of his intentions, but not his sense of Gawain's worth. Gawain responds to the revelation that he loved his life with anger and shame. At one level, this seems entirely reasonable. If he learned one thing through the exchange of blows, it was that he was not entirely ready to give up his life, even though he wanted to believe he was. And in fact, I think he did believe he was, but he wasn't, in fact, ready. The Green Knight's words confirm something Gawain learns when he shrank away or cringed during the first blow. He's not who he thought he was. As the Green Knight swings his axe, the poet focuses the reader's attention on Gawain again. But Gawain caught a sidelong glance of that axe as it came gliding down, shining to him to harm, and shrank a little with the shoulders, anticipating the sharp iron. So again, we get that S sound. So and shrank a little with the shoulders for the sharp iron. So every time that axe is coming, we get that swishing sound. And he also sees it, right? We get this glance. Now the Green Knight berates Gawain at this point, saying he's not who he thought he was. Gawain defends himself by insisting, "Stand you a stroke and start no more until your axes hit me." So he said, just actually hit me. Don't pretend to hit me. According to Guillaume Bolens, a start is a spontaneous movement, an emotional reaction of the whole body. When Gawain contracts his shoulders, she writes, his start blocks the chivalric mechanism he's supposed not only to activate, but also to embody. In other words, his body's instinctive and involuntary response belies his claim he will willingly endure this blow. And surely anyone who imagines his body moving in this way as the axe falls can not only empathize, but also sympathize with him. Most readers know what it feels like to flinch involuntarily and understand the embarrassment it might cause. And here it's basically his natural love of life or desire to live is emerging from him in a moment where he's determined to give up his life for his king. Gawain's initially embarrassed that his body's involuntary response betrays him, and he's even more ashamed when the Green Knight reminds him that he actually had acted voluntarily earlier to preserve it by taking the girdle. Gawain's embodied response, voluntary and involuntary to the Green Knight's words, is revealing, and here's the next slide. That other strong man stood thoughtfully a great while, so aggrieved for shame he shuddered within. All the blood of his breast rushed to his face, that he cringed for shame at what the man said. The first words upon that field that the man spoke, "Cursed be cowardice and covetous both. In you is villainy and vice, that virtue destroys." So although Gawain stands still here, his shame makes him shudder internally, and his involuntary blush betrays him the same way it does later when he tells the story to Arthur. So we can tell that he's ashamed and he can't in any way hide that. It emerges from him involuntarily, creating and revealing the discomfort caused by his shame when he blushes and cringes or shrinks. Whatever they think of his actions, readers are invited to share Gawain's discomfort as they imagine him blushing, shuddering, and cringing. So these kinesic images, and that word kinesic is one that describes sort of kinetic aspect, that it's active, but also it's the way in which we can see an image and then imagine it and simulate it ourselves. They draw on the audience's involuntary responses as well to simulate the emotion Gawain might be feeling. And as the stanza comes to its conclusion, Gawain accuses himself of faulty and false behavior. "Allow me to overcome your goodwill, and ever I shall be grateful." Over the course of roughly a stanza, Gawain's mood shifts. He goes from expressing anger at the Green Knight for playing games to being angry at himself for not playing them well enough. Whether he's moved by Gawain's palpable discomfort or his words, the Green Knight anticipates Arthur's actions at the end of Gawain by trying to comfort Gawain. He uses laughter as a sign of his goodwill while he assures Gawain that his confession makes him as pure as one who had never sinned. So go ahead, Brian. Then the other man laughed and lovingly said, "I hold it heartily healed, the harm that I had. You are confessed so clean, having recognized your mistakes, and have had for your penance the edge of my blade. I hold you absolved of that plight and purified as cleanly as if you had never sinned since you were first born. This is actually also a bit of a callback to Pearl. That's the same idea that she basically dies before she can be aware of sin. And so it's an interesting, again, connection between those poems. Now, John Burrow has pointed out instances of laughter like this might actually reflect moments when the character might be smiling rather than laughing, but I think the effect's the same whether one interprets the expression one way or another. In his study of contemporary social exchanges, Robert Provine found that speakers laughed more than their audiences, and I hope that won't be the case tonight, but it's very often the case. In most instances, laughter serves as punctuation, for laughter by speakers almost always follows complete statements or questions. Laughter also usually accompanies innocuous statements rather than jokes. This all reveals laughter is about relationships rather than simply about humor, so we need to reassess the assumptions we often make about it. Here, the Green Knight's laughter seems designed to reinforce his message to Gawain. You might not be who you thought you were, but it's going to be okay. The problem now is Gawain's not ready to accept the person he's found himself to be. When the Green Knight's laughter doesn't assuage Gawain, he tries some other tactics. He offers Gawain reconciliation. Gawain rejects the Green Knight's graceful offer, unleashing a violent diatribe against women that lasts a full stanza. And I'm not going to cite it here because these kind of attacks get quoted far too often, and I'm not going to apologize for it, but I want to suggest it might not be as gratuitous as I once thought it was. First, it seems totally out of character. This is just not how Gawain is expected to behave or how he does behave. And it may not be surprising that Gawain might hold misogynist views, but the text's emphasis on his manners heightens the sense of incongruity when he expresses them suddenly and emphatically. Second, Gawain's desire to blame someone else for what's happened to him is exactly what we would expect of someone who has just had a traumatic experience. Having spent quite a bit of time expressing his distorted feelings of guilt, Gawain now shifts to distorted feelings of blame. So it's remarkably consistent if we think about this as traumatic experience. Perhaps the Green Knight's laughter triggers Gawain's outburst, for laughter is linked to many aspects of the games people play in Gawain. Arthur's court is initially characterized by noise and laughter. Ladies laugh out of enjoyment while simply playing their games. But the laughter and sense of camaraderie in Arthur's hall is completely cut off when the Green Knight appears, at which point everyone becomes completely silent. And the situation becomes almost unbearably awkward because nobody knows how to react. The many good men could not muster the courage to speak and sat silent as stones, truly odd. The Green Knight heightens the tension by gesturing with his eyes and beard, intimidating the members of Arthur's court by issuing a silent challenge. As he rolled his red eyes around that wide hall, his eyebrows arched, which were awesomely green, and he swung his head side to side, seeing who'd rise. Even worse from their perspective, his laughter at the lack of response causes the king to blush and then act out of shame, which, as Brené Brown reminds us, is never a good idea. Go ahead. Then he laughed out so loudly the Lord was offended. Arthur blushed as his bombast, his boasting, his pride and gall. As wroth as reckless mind the knights were, one and all, that court's great king chagrined stood haughtily in hall. The laughter that the Green Knight offers Gawain as a sign of reconciliation at the end of the text echoes the scornful laughter that he used to goad Arthur into a rash response at the beginning. If Gawain wants someone to blame other than himself, both the Green Knight and Arthur seem like pretty good candidates. After all, Gawain only ends up agreeing to the exchange of blows with the Green Knight because Arthur was unable gracefully to resolve an awkward situation caused by the scornful laughter. Thus, the Green Knight's laughter causes and marks the forward into which Gawain enters at the beginning of the poem. A different sort of laughter that marks the forward Gawain makes with his host at Haute Desert, who turns out to be the Green Knight in disguise. So after they make their agreement, the poet reveals they each laughed. Laughter characterizes Gawain's visit at Haute Desert, for it's a feature of the banquets he enjoys each night during his stay, and it also plays a key role in the wooing scenes that eventually lead Gawain to accept the girdle. And here I'll get you to go to the next one. So these take place in Fit 3, and they're some of the most awkward in the poem, or anywhere in late medieval literature, I'd argue, and they use laughter to temper the mood a little bit. So whereas the Green Knight successfully engages Arthur by putting pressure on his ability to respond gracefully to derisive laughter, the host's wife puts pressure on Gawain's ability to respond gracefully to seductive, or at least friendly laughter. The challenge for Gawain, who has a reputation as the most courteous knight in the world, is to resist her advances without offending her. Given what unfolds in Fit 3, this is not nearly as easy as it sounds. And I think what's interesting here is I don't think many readers think he's going to be suddenly overcome by nature and just desire of her. That doesn't seem to be the stakes here. It's how can he
let her down in a courtly way when she's expressing herself so overtly to him. So, having spent his first night at Haute Désert in lavish comfort, Gawain finds himself in a profoundly awkward situation the next morning. He's lying in bed when he hears someone enter the room, close the door, and move quickly towards the bed. So basically, she sits down on the bed, and here's what the great man does. The man blushed and laid himself down lustily and pretended to be asleep. This does not seem to deter the host's wife, who approaches the bed in a scene that seems to unfold in slow motion. She comes closer to the bed, casts up the curtains, and sits on the side of the bed, gazing at Gawain, and waited there a really long time to be there when he would wake up. And of course, Gawain now is in fact already awake. She's waiting for him to wake up, and they both probably know it. So Gawain doesn't know what to do next. He plays for time, but still pretending he's asleep. Next slide. The man lay still a full long while, thinking in his mind what the circumstances might mean or amount to. To marvel, he thought, but yet he said to himself, it would be more seemly to learn through conversation what she wants. So finally he wakes up, and a moment that resonates, this chapter actually initially was a comparison of this and the scene Fleabag, but it resonates with an opening scene in Fleabag. He turns towards the woman and looks at her. And then, in actually quite astonishingly Augustinian imagery, next slide, please. He woke and twisted and turned towards her and unlocked his eyelids and acted as if surprised and crossed himself, as by act he might earn salvation, with his hand, with chin and cheek full sweet, both white and red mixed together, full lovely does she speak, with small laughing lips. So this is another moment where Burroughs suggests the laughing lips might refer to a smile rather than an actual laugh. But laughter's not out of the question here, especially since it conforms to the pattern she and her husband have consistently used. It seems designed to put him at ease, but also to put him on edge. And it's marked by the same twisting and turning in bed that Augustine describes in the Confessions when he's sort of trying to work through his feelings and eventually turning towards God. And the scene ultimately confronts the audience with an awkward question. What can Gawain say to resolve this situation gracefully? So this keeps on going on, and it's all marked by the lady's laughter. And I'm just going to skip through a little bit to, can you go to the next slide? I'll see if it's the next one here or the next one on. Yes, here we go. So until she gets very much more forceful and says to him very explicitly, you are welcome to my body, your own, one to deal with as you please. Required by fine force, I'm compelled to be your servant, and I shall. So this is very explicit. There's no question about what she's offering here. But after some further conversation, Gawain thinks he's managed the situation well, and with a glint laughed. But she doubles back to make sure that he will grant her a kiss out of courtesy. He complies, and at this point, he finally gets out of bed. So this happens again on the second and the third day. Again, they keep laughing, and then they exchange a second kiss. The lady raises the stakes on the third day, and at this point arrives in a very provocative outfit. So this is the next slide. Her healthy face and her throat made all naked, her breast bare before and also behind. She comes within the chamber door and closes it after her. There's some debate about whether she's actually sort of topless, but I think people have agreed she's probably not. But nonetheless, it's meant to be very seductive here. So she again invites the lady's clearly having fun with the situation at this point, and has become even more forthright. The lovely lady came laughing sweetly, fell over his fair face, and elegantly kissed him. So now she's not waiting for a kiss, she's just simply kissed him. And as the exchange continues, Gawain finds himself approaching the situation in which Lancelot finds Galahad in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Faced with flirtatious women, it seems as though the peril for Gawain, as for Galahad in the Castle Anthrax, is becoming far too perilous. So, with smooth and gentle smiling, they fell into mirth. That all was bliss and fortunate that passed between them, and blissful they exchanged good words. Much richness then was therein, great peril between them stood, unless Mary remembers her knight. So basically the only thing that can save him now is Mary. And yet Mary's knight manages to turn his skill in love talking to his advantage, and he's able to parry the lady's advances. And we hear with love laughing a little, he laid beside him all the suggestive speeches that sprang from her mouth. So here he's using laughter, so we can see he's able to play the game. He manages to resist her while allowing them both to save face until a moment when she offers him a gift. He refuses the ring, as I said before, but he can't refuse the girdle, which may not seem valuable but does something special in that anyone who wears it may not be slain. Who, after all, would want to give up living when life is filled with so much laughter? It's only later he realizes what it cost it to accept him, what it costs him to accept it. The knowledge he's not the man he thought he was. So paradoxically then, Gawain finds himself unwilling to accept the grace the Green Knight offers him in their final encounter because he realizes he shouldn't have accepted the promise the girdle seemed to offer. This pattern's repeated when he doesn't laugh, or if we think he doesn't laugh with the rest of Arthur's court at the end of the text, because he has been taken in by laughter before. He did so much work to fit in with the host and his wife by laughing with them and just going with it, but the sense of belonging he felt with them proved to be false. Can he risk being vulnerable again? Is the laughter at Arthur's court a sign of belonging, or is it just as seductive as the laughter he experiences in Haute Desert? Questions like these might be enough for anyone to put up barriers to connection, but Gawain has also been frightened in a way that is life-changing. A Green Knight sliced his neck with an axe, and he has to live with the idea he only survived because the other man chose to show him grace. The Green Knight may have had his reasons for what he did, but the whole thing seems pretty outrageous when considered more carefully. Should Gawain have really given up his life for Arthur? Perhaps. But for a game? Perhaps not. How can he live now, knowing what he knows about his own complicity in this exchange, not to mention Arthur's? So Gawain resists connecting with those around him because he's been hurt by the games people play, yet he feels compelled to play those games. He feels both guilt and apportions some blame to others, yet he does not seem to have the grace to recognize, as Augustine does, that this is what makes him human. Most of us probably know what it feels like to be hurt and confused because mistakes have been made. And most of us also know that it can take time to feel ready, to feel like we want to be consoled or to laugh again, especially if we're unwilling to forgive ourselves or for others for simply being human, for making mistakes. It would probably help Gawain if anyone other than him were to take some responsibility for the events that led him to think he was going to die, although nobody does. Having said that, though, I'm kind of heartened thinking about the final scene in Gawain. The comfort Arthur offers and the laughter of the court may make Gawain feel even more alone at this particular moment, but perhaps it's possible to imagine the gestures of comfort and eruptions of laughter will one day be seen again as opportunities to connect, to commune with others in a way that is less concerned with fitting in and more with belonging. I don't think Gawain needs to change to make others more comfortable. Instead, the poem asks us to consider the circumstances in which someone who has experienced hurt, loss, or trauma might find connection again. It also suggests that laughter offers a nuanced way to understand connection, for it can seduce and disgust, and those moments can feel like heaven or like hell. In short, laughter and awkwardness offer Gawain and his audience a way of exploring the different ways humans might connect through rather than despite their imperfections. So one of those imperfections, by way of ending, might be the assumptions we make about how and others view the world. So for example, again, drawing on my empathic response to personal experience, I might assume the expression on this face reveals pain. But what if he's smiling or even laughing? This raises many questions about how we encounter other cultures in our own time, as well as what happens when we try to connect with the past by reading literature or, say, building or visiting churches. While I've suggested tonight the Green Knight is a kind of green man that represents nature and Gawain is the kind of green man from whom nature erupts, I also wonder if it's possible to see Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the characters and the poem, as a way of showing us the folly of imagining that a clear distinction can be made between humans and nature, or perhaps even between nature and sacred spaces. At the end of the poem, Gawain may have gained experience, but he's still green in the sense that he is not yet fully mature. He cannot seem to accept the nature of his humanity or the humanity of his nature. Perhaps he would have benefited from some advice from a non-human actor. Like Gawain, Kermit the Frog starts out by recognizing it's not easy being green, but as he matures from one stanza to the next of his song, he seems to accept himself in a way that Gawain cannot, and he finally concludes, "I'm green, and it'll do fine. It's beautiful, and I think it's what I want to be." Thanks. All right, now I think we're going to have some refreshments and then time for questions and answers. So
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, does that sound
Yep.
good? So you have a moment to think about your question.
All right. Yeah?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this isn't an entirely coherent thought, but I'm thinking of how Arthur's court hangs together if it does, and it's always at risk of fragmentation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things the Green Knight is doing is testing the court. It's got this reputation for being the most courteous court with the most amazing knights, and
Yeah.
and they want to see, you know. And I'm thinking of that moment where everyone's laughing, maybe at Gawain. And it would be very easy, naturally, to sympathize with his blush, right?
Yeah.
But there's some sort of like mass resistance to that sympathy, and instead they're going to come together with one another and laugh and reject the sympathy. And emotionally, maybe he's cast out at that moment.
Yeah.
But then also they decide to wear the girdle in solidarity with him in the same moment. So emotionally, he's sort of cast out. But then what? Like pragmatically or courteously brought back in?
Yeah, well, I think that in many ways is the question, right? So that is a coherent thought in the sense that that's exactly, I think, what we don't know is, are they, so they seem to be sort of inviting him back in, but they're disagreeing with his interpretation, right? But for whose sake, I think is kind of the question, right? Where he sees the girdle as a sign of shame, and they're like, no, it's not. And then, of course, this isn't, we don't think, the source of that motto, but it does sort of, like, that motto invites, like, sort of, shame on him who thinks ill of it, is like, I dare you, right? Like, yes, of course this is a shameful mark, but I dare you to think that, because we actually are reclaiming it in some other way. And and there's so many instances in Arthur's court where that might actually be the case, right? Like, especially the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, that it's like, shame on you for thinking ill of that, because in fact it's a sign of our greatness. And so I think that question of like what it means for Gawain himself as an individual, right, and what it means for the court, and whether Gawain can sort of either get over that or see himself as part of that, because he clearly does not read the girdle. He explicitly doesn't read the girdle as a sign of honor, right? It's definitely a sign of shame for him. And then they're like, no, we'll take it as a sign of honor that you did this thing. And so they're saying no to his interpretation, but it's possible, right? There's a reading of that where that's done to celebrate him and say, no, you don't have to feel bad about yourself. Look what you actually accomplished. But there's also a reading where they're like, how dare you express shame? There's no room for that here. And I don't think the poem gives us a clear answer to that. In fact, it precisely raises that ambiguity. And that question of like, how are they being held together then? Is everything being held together as a sort of, is it a facade? Or do they actually all believe that they're all together in this? Like, whatever decision they make, right? Is it a veneer, or is it deeply held that they all share a belief? But I think that question of whether they're aligned or not with Gawain, they definitely aren't. But why? Like, for what purpose? Is it for them? What will it do to Gawain? I think it's a like, that's in many ways, in my view, the question the poem is asking us to think about. And I'm not sure, I think. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Does Gawain have to, like, do those bad emotions have to move to Gawain, and then?
Yeah,
No,
like,
he
is he
ta-
going to
he
be
ta-
sort of scapegoated,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's I think that's a real possibility, that he's going to be scapegoated. And one of the reasons for thinking that is that it happens in most Arthurian stories I can think of off the top of my head now, that somebody is scapegoated at some point, right? Like, so in Mallory, certainly Mordred, right, Nagravain, and there are other knights at other times in that text. But I'm even thinking of like Lanval, Marie de France's Lay, where what happens is Arthur is sort of meant to be very generous, but he keeps forgetting Lanval, and so he meets this sort of fairy maiden out one day by the river, and she gives him all this stuff, but the one condition is he can't say anything about her. But then when he does, Guinevere initially he sort of comes back in, and Guinevere is attracted to him, and then he eventually says, no, I can't be with you. I have this, other woman who looks after me. And then eventually she leaves, and then she eventually comes back and sort of saves him. But that idea but he has to go, right? He can't stay around. That idea that someone has to be cast out for the unity to stay, I think, is a very common feature. And so I think that's entirely possible, right? If Gawain fits in this. It's interesting that Gawain, though, doesn't resolve it, right? Like, he has to go out and come back, and that's a fairly typical thing, but it doesn't resolve whether at the end he's going to be reintegrated or he's going to be left out. And so I think that open question of what they're doing to hold to hold that solidarity is
in many ways one of the key elements it's asking. I should maybe say, actually, because I think this is a great opportunity that you've given me to say the fitting in and belonging. I didn't really. This is from part of this was inspired by tonight, and then I sort of was mixing in with the chapter from my book, and Brene Brown makes this distinction between fitting in and belonging, right? That we all want to sort of, ultimately, she argues, we all want to belong in some way. We will, and that means different things. But the distinction between belonging and fitting in is that belonging, you belong in the sense that you belong for as who you are. You don't have to change who you are to belong, but fitting in requires changing something fundamental about yourself to fit in, right? So that other people might like you, or you hope other people might like you, whereas belonging involves a sort of complete vulnerability of the self, and that others will accept you for that. So those are very different things, right? They you know, and of course there are areas where we might feel one is happening and it's actually the other, or vice versa. But I think that's the question at the end is, like, is Gawain going to choose to fit in or not? Or is there a sense of belonging? Like, and are the other knights actually just fitting in and trying to do it, trying to do what they're meant to be doing? So I think that's for me, unresolved at the end, but it's what's interesting about the poem, because it does sort of suggest that that idea of fitting in might be what's both holding Arthur's court together, but ultimately why Arthur's court is always at risk, or at, not even at risk, but it's imminently pulling apart too.
So just building on all of that, when you sort of suggested that Gawain might be a kind of scapegoat, I mean, I don't know, building off in response to Sayward here, you know, that immediately calls to mind for me something of like there's a sense in which he is a kind of sacrificial victim, right? There's a kind of ritual, like an aborted ritual that happens with his like near execution, right?
Yeah.
And it's not clear exactly why this ritual is taking place, right? It's like, why does other than the Green Knight wants to, like, you know, as Say is saying, test the community and you know, check its cohesion. But like, in any case, if that's true, if there's a sense in which there's a kind of ritual taking place of the beheading of Gawain at the chapel, there's also a sense in which now Gawain has like entered like the realm of the sacred, right? He is the sacrificed man, right? He is the man who has been taken out of communion with other people, in a sense, you know what I mean? Like, the rest of us all exist in like the normal realm of normal things, and he's been put over here in the realm of the sacrificed.
Yeah.
And so that would seem to do something to his ability to like reconnect with people. Like he is now he's sacred or something. I don't know. It's just a thought, but like, I don't know what you would do with that, but.
No, I think that's right. And in fact, the poem sort of suggests that partly through his arrival at Haute d'Isère. Like, one of the odd things about that moment, right, and why you'd sort of think Gawain should think something's up here, is he gets to Haute d'Isère and he explains he has to go to the Green Chapel. And they say, oh, well, that's fine. Like, that's nearby. Why don't you just enjoy yourself while you're here? All the men are going to go hunting. All the ladies are going to sort of stay around the house during the day. Why don't you stay with them? Right? Like, he's not invited on the hunt. Right? It's not like he says, no, I'd rather not hunt. I've just come in from the wilds, and, you know, all these other things. He's just like, no, I'll stay here. They just tell him that's what to do. So that sense, and then in fact, he doesn't like hang out with them. It's he's in his chamber, and this other lady sort of comes in to try and tempt him, and we get this sort of other game. But the initial setup does seem to suggest that he's no longer part of that sort of homosocial society, that he has been sort of, that something is fundamentally changed about the way he's even treated in the quest. And part of that is that sort of, again, I think also, this is where I disagree with Richard Firth Green on it, about the sort of, it may well be a different poet, but again, there's all these connections to the other texts, but there's the 3 days, right? Like, he's been set out to sacrifice himself, and he's there for 3 days before he's actually ends up born anew, right? And so there's that sense of that preparation of the sacrifice, and that he will then, you know, get himself in the right mind and ultimately offer himself up. That I think, and again, without, like, he's sort of, you know, in exchange for what he did earlier, right, this blow, there's all sorts of questions about, like, well, should he have actually cut off his head? Should he have just sort of like struck him? How is that game supposed to work? Should he have struck him bluntly, right? Would that have meant he would get a blunt strike back? But of course, if you cut off his head, he's not coming back. But this is a sort of older story that would happen. But I think that is an interesting way of thinking about that moving into the sacred. And in fact, if I can maybe push it a little bit further, I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head, and connect it to some of the other texts that I'm thinking of, but particularly Julian of Norwich, in the sense that, it's not just a man who's willing to go and sacrifice himself in this sort of exchange game, but say an anchoress who's willing to give up her life for God, and become sacred, but that does cut off relationships, right? And we see she has exchanges with people, but she's not supposed to have friendships anymore, or to be part of the community in the same way. That she might offer guidance, people might come to her for sort of ideas, but once she enters that sacred space, it's cutting her off. And so, yeah, rather than necessarily thinking along the lines of the scapegoat, although I think that's perfectly legitimate, one could also think along the lines of, renouncing the world, right? Dying to the world, or being willing to give oneself up to the world, for, in either case, one's Lord, right? Either Arthur in this case, or God. But you can see there, like, I think Gawain is playing out some of those allegories of what that might mean. Does that kind of get at that answer? Yeah.
I got the mic, so
Okay.
I thought we should keep it in this row.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of a hot potato. It's yeah.
This will take things in a different direction. And I'm really struck. Well, you were just reading the part where the Green Knight pronounces him as clean as the day is born, or as pure as the day is born.
Yeah.
It is after that he has his little rant against women. Is
Yes.
that true? Yeah. Well, see, that just struck me anew, because, and just thinking about the greenness that, like he gets forgiven by the priest, like he shrives himself, right? And that's curiously kind of in between the time that he has taken the belt,
Yes.
but prior to having to give the belt, right? And so it's a very sneaky sin that he gets caught in, and and it always strikes me that he's perfectly unaware of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then he goes out and is tested in the woods, right, at the Green Chapel, and then the Green Man pronounces him clean, right? Then he has his rant against women, which, as some of my students pointed out, as well as, like, this is in fact goes right back to the Garden of Eden. This is what Adam says, right?
Yeah.
It's Eve's fault. She gave me the fruit.
Yeah.
Right. And just thinking about him being pronounced like as clean as the day is born, and this natural scene that has been a kind of horrific scene. Does it become a kind of paradise scene where he's kind of recapitulating like the original fall?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Actually, if we can maybe go back on the right back near the beginning. There's the one of, and these are actually fairly, I wouldn't say common, but there are a number of them about this like Tree of Mercy image. And actually, just as you were saying that, it struck me, I hadn't made that connection, but yeah, this one here. So this is the larger version, but then this is the sort of close-up. So it just kind of struck me that sort of cyclical idea then, that this is sort of back to the Garden of Eden then, but that's also then, if we think of Gawain as the Green Man as much as the Green Knight, then he's sort of restarting this pattern that will lead through, like, for that sort of cycle within, that he's now representing Adam, who, well, and typologically, right, he also could be Adam, who will also be a kind of Christ, right? Like there's that kind of typological function there. So I think that, yeah, that's really interesting, I think, to think about that this is going back. And of course, he is in a kind of paradise, right? Haute Desert sort of has everything, but that Green Chapel, I mean, it's sort of like, they talk about it as a kind of, place of the devil, like it's kind of, but it also has everything one needs, right? And that may be why it's so like, so I guess uncanny in some way. That's a really interesting thought, I think, to think about, that it goes back to paradise, but then I think, as the poem so often does, right, it's like paradise for whom?
Right? It's, and again, because one of the other elements of the poem that actually, just to come back to the why they're doing this, right? It's Morgan. I glossed over this briefly, but it's Morgan apparently wants to shame Arthur. That's the issue. And like, whether or not that's worked, it turns out maybe it didn't work, but weirdly then what work is Bertilac doing, right? Why wouldn't he shame Arthur? Is this meant to shame Arthur by sending Gawain back and the girdle being shameful? Gawain seems to read it that way, but the court in no way feels that shame, right? They're just, whether they recognize it and refuse it or not, I think is interesting. And so that idea, but the Green Knight seems to offer him this like total, like he says to him, you're completely clean. And are we meant to take that as ironic or not? And maybe that's part of it too. Like the other way, I guess, of reading that is, it's ironic. He has no authority to shrive him, and therefore we actually then see him sort of engage in a kind of sinful behavior. So I think you could potentially read it one way or the other, like by sort of blaming women for this fall. But I think that's interesting actually to think about that recreation of the Garden of Eden, especially as he sort of reads this as his temptation. And it is life, right? It's the same thing. I mean, the tree of life is sort of a knowledge kind of question, but here he wants to live on, right? That's why he takes the girdle. So there's a similar sort of idea about the fruit also possibly, offering eternal life. So I actually think that's a really good thing I hadn't really thought about. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I like what you were arguing about the ambiguity. And as you know, the ending really comes up quickly.
Yes.
It's barely a stanza. And it looks back to the beginning of the poem, which is actually a really big beginning because there are, I think, 120 lines before any action happens in the court. And so, there's the reference to Troy, there's the reference to Aeneas fleeing Troy, coming to Britain, descendants founding Britain, having adventures and marvels, and so on. So, but the ending is really quick. And, C.S. Lewis and many others have said that one of the differences between modern readers reading stories with their taste for suspense and surprise is that medievals read stories that by and large they knew the ends to already. So this ending of a young court and a young author, people know where this goes. They know where the court goes. In various versions, they know where Gawain goes in terms of the fall of the kingdom. And I find myself, in this really interesting context that you're putting the poem in, I find myself thinking about two endings elsewhere, and one of them is in a poem by T.S. Eliot, The Journey of the Magi, where the ending is that they come back to their kingdom and they're not at home. They can't fit in, and they don't belong. And the other is, oddly, and I hope I'm not spoiling this for people, a story by Flannery O'Connor, A Good Man is Hard to Find. And can I dress this up without really spoiling the ending for people? I'll try. In the ending, a character who's been very censorious and uncompassionate has compassion on a man who's been very nasty indeed. And she says, "Oh, you're just one of my babies." And he ends her life. He can't. Sorry. And did you hear any of that? Yeah. And he ends her life. And this kind of, what is elicited traumatically from Gawain that sets him apart from, but also casts light on the court, is I think, a really interesting way to go at the poem.
Yeah. And actually, go ahead.
No.
So there are two things I immediately thought of actually that I think are really enriching there. One is to think about the cycle, right? And back to, Aeneas. So the start of the poem is Sithen the Isolta and the siege was Caesar the Troia, and the
Tulkramas, that the Burners Bernard, I think is the second line. So basically, since the assault and the siege were ceased at Troy, and basically all the towers burnt, and then Aeneas leaves the city, right, and that leads on eventually to the founding of Britain through Aeneas and then through Brutus, and so that sense of the one exiled who is the foundation becomes really important. And actually, so thinking about the ending as the beginning is something I hadn't really, like I thought about it, but just not in these terms, right? About him now not belonging at the end. Or perhaps feeling that sense of exile, that might be the crucial, he might be the foundation. In fact, he's the foundation in a way I've already alluded to of the Garter Knight, or at least they're sort of pointing back to this sort of Garter Knight tradition. But I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it on the one hand, that in fact it's anticipating a kind of exile, but an exile that will be important in some fundamental way. And it may not be him immediately, but possibly as it follows on. And yeah, thinking about where Gawain goes, because many people would know, one of the things about this, the poet calls it a lay at one point, and one of the things about lay is they're very often an episode in a story that's known, so that this is sort of one episode of Gawain, but you're meant to already know a bunch of things about Gawain and about where Gawain eventually goes. And so this is just revealing something very particular, and it does telescope a lot of things that, like, so a long introduction that doesn't seem to be going anywhere at first, or necessarily going where we think it's going to go, and then this exchange game, and then all of a sudden, like, what is it, 12 months pass, or 11 months pass, I guess, because he basically spends a month going, exactly the scene from Monty Python, actually. It's the sort of, spring passed, and then they gave another season a miss, and then went right on. And then he basically, it's like, oh, and a bunch of stuff happened to him out in the forest. And then on the way back, a bunch of stuff happened to him out in the forest, and then he's back again, right? So it's really telling us what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to, or you can well imagine another romance expanding on that. But the other one, actually, I thought about, Maria, as you're saying that, was actually Tolkien, who loved this poem and translated it, in fact. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, right, the hobbits find they can't go back to the Shire, right? The hobbits who have been away. And of course, that was Tolkien's experience of the war as well, that, like, it's not what it was because he isn't who he was, right? That sort of sense that, and actually, now that I think about it, I've been talking about that sort of traumatic experience, and how many men in the Middle Ages must have felt that way coming back after campaign. And especially at this point, right? This poem's written in the 100 Years' War. There are numerous campaigns at various points. We don't know exactly when this poem was written. For a long time, it was thought late 14th century, but I think people think a little bit earlier. But there's certainly a number of campaigns that any soldier might have been on. And so how might this have spoken to them coming back and being like, everyone's laughing and they were celebrating your honor, and you're like, you know what? People were dying in their own vomit on the battlefield. Like they were, they'd get cut by an arrow and they'd die like Henry, right, in several days of dysentery, right? There's nothing glorious about what we were doing. That sense we get, like, later of Wilfred Owen sort of writing about those things, but here is, maybe this poet writing about that. And I hadn't really thought about that until you mentioned that. So thank you. I think that's that sense of that, it just sort of ends abruptly, but it causes all these other possible associations. Yeah, that's great.
I have my thoughts written down just so that I can be more concise. So I was really loving just hearing your thoughts about how the emotional kind of inner journey happens alongside the journey of the text as well. And so I had two kind of points that I was wondering about. One being more relevant to what we were talking about with the Green Knight, with Gawain going to confessional, as you had mentioned before going to the Green Chapel. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So there's the question of, like, him being considered pure or considered ready for judgment in that way. Would the Green Knight then be sort of a true confessor or confession in the idea that that is when he's at his most honest and vulnerable, is with the Green Knight as a person?
Yeah, I think that's a good question in that he, So there are like two confessions effectively, or sort of two, like confession and penance maybe, and then confession again, because he goes to a priest apparently, like the sort of chaplain, right, of the house, and most houses would have a chaplain of some kind like that, and so that sort of, it seems very straightforward. But then then he goes to the Green Chapel, and so I think you're right that he's at his most vulnerable in that, partly because he thinks he's confessed everything, right? Or he really believes he's done everything. And it comes sort of as a surprise that, oh, you hadn't confessed this, right? About the girdle. And then though the knight or the Green Knight then says, well, now you have, everything is clean, right? I now offer you that absolution. And I think that vulnerability, like literally he's vulnerable, right? He's exposing his neck to have his head cut off. But I think also emotionally, that's what's interesting, is we could see how raw and vulnerable he is at that moment of the neck. That's why his response is so like just emerges from him. So I think that sense that, yeah, this is the most vulnerable, probably even more vulnerable, I think, as you're sort of suggesting, than one would normally be in confession, right? You can imagine confession sometimes being vulnerable, but sometimes also being very like
measured kind
yes,
of. And as you had mentioned, the girdle, the second part of the questioning I was having was like girdles at that time being associated as like a woman's garment. Often also in like the Anglican tradition of like wearing it as part of a priestly robe, but in this case, a woman's garment. And just kind of an emasculating kind of presence with how he's meant to wear it in order to prevent harm. And I also just, it comes to mind like the exclusion of Gawain from the hunting party while sitting at home in the castle. There's sort of a queering, you might say, of relationships in the Green Knight, and like in Saturnalia or like Christmas games, sometimes there are like the swapping of roles and that sort of thing. And in the original part of the story, that's when this story begins, is around Christmas time with this kind of switching of roles happening. I guess my point of it with the girdle and the vulnerability is how does that sort of question Gawain's relationship to Bertilac and his honesty with the emotions versus like how measured he is in his response to Lady of Bertilac? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So I may not. I'll. Yeah. Tell me if I don't answer it. In that, I really like the insight you're offering there about the again, the Christmas time and the switching of roles, and especially the potentially queering of this, because like one way, right? And actually, the Green Knight movie, which there are elements I really love about it, and then elements I'm like, I don't understand what's happening now. Why did this get added when something else got removed? But one of the things that really understands is like there's the moment before. I hope I'm not giving it away. I just told you the poem, but the movie doesn't quite work the same way. But there's this, I think, a fabulous scene just before he goes to the Green Chapel. Like he's there, and they tell him like, run away. Like, we won't tell anyone, just leave, right? And that would be one way of emasculating him, right? But also saving his life is like, no one's gonna, they all saw you go out. They all think you're gonna get your head cut off. If you don't come back, but you end up somewhere else and live a full life, you know, whatever. Or go back, and this is what the movie imagines, I think, really powerfully. Go back and live your life and say, you offered yourself to the Green Knight, or you overcame him, or whatever, right? And live a full life. But he realizes how hollow that life would be, right? He made a promise. He wants to keep his word. And so we get that sort of flash forward scene there that I think is like really a really good understanding, I think, of what Gawain's going through in that moment to go out, because it is that sense of vulnerability. He could make another choice there, but he does say, no, I'm going to fulfill my word. And so that sense, that's one option here. But actually the other sense of maybe of sort of queering this, or not thinking about masculinity in the way we might, or thinking about it as a kind of femininity, or thinking about it as sort of him adopting a different kind of role altogether, is that what would have saved him was complete vulnerability, right? Not apparently, right? Now we don't know. There's all sorts of interesting interpretations of this, of like, did in fact the girdle actually save him? Was that why he only got the nick in the neck? I think my reading is not that. It is that this was all a game. He was never meant to have his head actually cut off, but because that's sort of what everybody keeps on explaining, and that what would have actually saved him was complete vulnerability. and he can't quite get there. He thinks he has, but he doesn't quite get there. And so I think that's a really powerful reading, that actually that would have been what really saved him, and what would have allowed him to just come through this completely unscathed, rather than literally scathed in a way, right, that he comes through. So I think that's a really powerful way of thinking through this, that he's unwilling to relinquish, like he's willing to sort of take on certain roles and not behave in a certain way, but not fully until the end. And then he's not sure what that means, I think, is what is kind of interesting at the end. Yeah, that's I think a great, does that answer that question? Yeah, I didn't quite get to the lady, I think, quite as much as. Yeah, and no, I think that's I think that ties in, and I'm not quite sure how, but I think especially because as the more I read this poem, the less sort of really seductive the scenes between him and the woman are. It seems more that it's just all verbal play. It's just, we know he doesn't seem like he's going to be overcome with lust at any moment. It's just how do I get out of this in terms of the verbal play? Whereas the kisses are sort of like a very literal exchange. I mean, kisses get exchanged in between men on a regular basis, but it is really interesting that that's part of what's going on there, and there's no more or less sort of lustfulness, right, between the kisses with the woman and the kisses with the host. So that sense of ambiguity of where, and again, maybe that sacredness, right? That he's now there is no more male and female, maybe at this moment, in that, once he's removed from that sort of sociality. So yeah, I'll keep thinking about that. I think that's really, it's a great question.
Well, thank you so much. I think
There's
we can.
one more. Is that okay?
Is it?
Sure.
Okay, so the girdle actually, I believe, started as a man's garment, and the girdle went around the waist. It held up all the components that you put on over top of it, the weight of the armor, etc., etc.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this. Let's give Dr. David Watt another round of applause.